Welcome to the 2021 online edition of Faith, Life, and Learning at Ambrose University. Faith, Life, and Learning is an annual February event where we explore very practical ways in which our learning in a Christian university setting is integral to God's mission. Ways that Christian discipleship leads us to join in the healing and reconciling work of God for the renewal of the whole creation. And of course, this is the explicit mission of our university, to prepare men and women for wise, joyful, and redemptive engagement in the world, in society, and in the church. Our topic this year is one that Christians rarely seem to talk about: how the gospel of Jesus Christ is good news for today's captives, how Christian faith calls us to redemptive engagement with Canada's prisons and prisoners. Our speaker this year is Dr. Arlette Zinck, and her lecture tonight is entitled Serving the Mission Field in Your Own Backyard, a Christian Response to Prisons. Dr. Zinck is professor of English and director of the Ephesus Project at King's University, just up the road in Edmonton. She is an award-winning teacher specializing in the work of English Puritan writer John Bunyan. Through her volunteer work developing teaching support for Correctional Services of Canada, she was awarded a Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2012. And in 2018, Dr. Zinck's excellence in teaching was recognized when she was awarded a 3M National Teaching Fellowship. Just before I turn things over to Dr. Zinck, let me mention that she will also be our guest in tomorrow's online Ambrose Chapel service at 11:30 a.m. You can access that chapel service on the Ambrose website at ambrose.edu/chapel. Dr. Zinck will continue in conversation with me and some other members of the Ambrose community on this same topic, a Christian response to prisons. Dr. Zinck, we're delighted to welcome you to this digital space tonight here at Ambrose University.
Hello, and thanks for joining me. It's a great pleasure to be part of Ambrose University's Faith, Life, and Learning series. This conversation is about mission, about how we put our faith into action and become Christ's agents on earth. In the good old days, which my grandfather was fond of reminding me were not so good, mission generally implied overseas. The issues and concerns here at home often took a back seat to those an ocean away. Today, however, we are aware of how deeply Christian insight, compassion, and mercy are needed in every sphere of life. Our mission, as it were, has both broadened and become more local. Today, I want to talk to you about how you can walk into another world without leaving your own backyard. It's a handy trick you'll want to know, at least until the COVID travel ban lifts. Seriously, though, I want to talk about our prisons and how desperately we need to pay attention, to invest, and to bring the love of Christ to these places. Specifically, I want to talk to you about the role that education can play in correctional reform in Canada. It's been 8.5 years since I first walked into a prison. Believe me when I say that visiting a prison had not been on my bucket list. But as is often the case, God had other plans. And in the spring of 2012, I first stepped behind the wire that surrounded a maximum security prison. This strange COVID season aside, I've been going to prison regularly ever since. I find my calling there. I believe that we are all being asked to think more often and more deeply about what happens in our prisons and what role we as people of faith may have in shaping the conversation around crime and correction in Canada. In the short time we have together, I want to invite you into a discussion about how our faith tradition and national history has understood our responsibilities to prisons and prisoners. In using the word responsibility, I want to invoke both the meaning that suggests duty and obligation, but also the root sense of the term that asks how we are able to respond to the challenges that are before us. In exploring this latter sense, I will tell you a little about a venture my colleagues and I are involved with, a local post-secondary teaching initiative in our Canadian federal prisons called the Ephesus Project. I will leave you with a few hot tips about how you can become informed about and involved with the mission to support correctional reform here at home. Scorched earth, barbed wire, cement, metal bars, isolation, deprivation. Why would anyone want to spend their time in a place like that, especially with people you might generally cross the street to avoid meeting? You know the ones, the broken, the angry, the disappointed, the hungry, the desperate. The answer is clear, because Jesus requires it. Visiting the prisoner made it to his short list of duties in Matthew 25:36. Feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and visit the prisoners. We don't have to look very far to realize there is an enormous disparity between our gospel vision for dealing with human brokenness and the civil structures that North American nations have built to deal with crime. What we seldom consider, however, is how this system negatively affects all of us, not only those serving time. God alone redeems human beings, but human beings can set the context for that work. How the body of Christ responds or fails to makes all the difference to our civic life. Take a minute with me now to look at images from our Canadian federal institutions. Our federal prisons house people who are serving sentences longer than 2 years and a day, so the longer sentences. All of the pictures you are about to see come from the Correctional Investigators' annual reports to the Canadian government. While you are viewing the images, I will read you a few key passages of scripture that describe God's concern for the imprisoned. Isaiah 61:1. The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives, and release from darkness for the prisoners. Psalm 146:7. He upholds the cause of the oppressed and gives food to the hungry. The Lord sets prisoners free. Isaiah 49:9. This is what the Lord says: in the time of my favor, I will answer you, and in the day of salvation, I will help you. I will keep you and will make you to be a covenant for the people, to restore the land and to reassign its desolate inheritances, to say to the captives, come out, and to those in darkness, be free. Matthew 25:39. When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, truly, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Hebrews 13:3. Continue to remember those in prison as if you were together with them in prison, and those who are mistreated as if you yourselves were suffering. The Christian scriptures are soaked in deep concern for the imprisoned. In Europe and in North America, however, the Christian church's response to issues of crime and punishment have been a mixed bag. For every John Howard and Elizabeth Fry, there are distressing examples of misguided alliances between churches and the state. Tough on crime crusades have substituted for more faithful wrestling with the complex call to restoration and renewal, not only for the perpetrator and the victim, but for the community at large. A misguided application of meritocratic thinking, the belief that we get what we deserve, has seduced some branches of the church to embrace the understanding that crime is the state's responsibility alone. Crime and punishment requires nothing of us. It's a problem for the courts. Here in Canada, we continue to name our public institution the Correctional Services of Canada, and we endorse an institutional mission that seeks to actively encourage and assist offenders to become law-abiding citizens while exercising reasonable, safe, secure, and humane control. Yet while that is the mission assigned to our prisons, we, the people served by that institution, often distance ourselves from the work that goes on there. In the worst cases, we become seduced by the unchristian notion that by ignoring what happens in our prisons, we can ignore the social issues that contribute to crime and rid ourselves of the people who commit it. It's not long before punishment is an end in itself, rather than a consequence directed toward redress of harm and restoration of relationship. It's not long before those who serve time are so damaged, so stigmatized, so alienated from community that, quote, becoming a law-abiding citizen becomes less like the correctional goal and more like an I dare you. As we have turned the other way, punishment has become vengeance. The consequences have been devastating. The scriptures point us in a very different direction. Shalom is the end of our gracious God's plan. It's a vision for all of us. Paul argues in Romans that we all run into trouble with the law. We are simply unable to keep the law without God's help. Therefore, the law does not save. Rather, it shows us our limitations, our failings. Only love and the justice embodied in Jesus Messiah offers a solution to the condemnatory law. Justice is fulfilled by he who sits on the mercy seat. Justice does not abrogate the superior command to love God and to love each other. Our scriptures are also clear on another point. God alone redeems. We can't redeem one another, but we can set the context for God's work by following the prophet Micah's clear call to love mercy, do justice, and walk humbly with God. Our tradition demands that we operationalize the understanding made popular by US lawyer and advocate for the imprisoned Brian Stevenson. Each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I love this statement by Stevenson because it levels our field of vision to see the truth our scriptures proclaim. All of us, each and every one of us, is better than the worst thing we've ever done. We all fall short of the mark, and we all require God's forgiveness. There is no us and them. But even if we struggle with the notion that we owe those who have committed serious crime something more than unrelenting punishment, we can no longer look the other way from what our system is doing to victims of crime and the community at large. Restoration and renewal for the victim requires the prayerful, concrete support of community. We have to offer so much more than a court-sanctioned opportunity for revenge. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, and it's a good thing too, since the emotional satisfaction of revenge on our fallen human flesh soon destroys the soul and begins an endless cycle of tragedies. We, the body of Christ, are called to love our enemies. We are called to forgiveness. The health and vigor of our eternal souls depends upon it. But ask anyone who has suffered the will to make good on those scriptural injunctions during times of acute suffering is more than any of us can handle on our own. The pursuit of wholeness and healing, implied in the biblical concept of shalom, requires a full engagement with both those who commit crimes and those victimized by them. We, the church, cannot lose sight of our mission and fall in with broken notions advocated by the community at large. We are called to lead our communities, to become knowledgeable, involved advocates for a truly biblical vision of justice that leads to shalom. As Christian commentator Dominique Dubois-Guillard argues in Rethinking Incarceration, Advocating for Justice that Restores, rooting our response to crime and its subsequent punishment in the grace first extended to us is not to be soft on crime. It means responding to crime in a Christocentric way. Crime must be addressed and punishment needs to be issued, but as followers of Christ, our response must be different from the broader world's. That Christocentric way has everything to do with relationship. Biblical justice is relational. The call is to care for everyone, but there is an extra instruction for those who are to be punished for the offense. We are to care for the imprisoned as though we were also imprisoned. Hebrews 13:3. It's a tall order. How can we do that if we have no relationship with our prisons and the people who work and live there? Since so many of us have never visited a prisoner, we have to rely on external information. Luckily, here in Canada, there's an excellent source of accurate information. Each year, the Office of the Correctional Investigator issues a report to the Canadian government and to the Canadian people about the system of so-called correction we have built. The report contains clear-sighted and implementable recommendations for things that need to be improved. Unfortunately, these recommendations are regularly ignored. Our politicians tend to spend time on the things that will garner votes. Apparently, caring for the prisoner does not make that cut. To cite a recent example, last October, Maclean's magazine included a bleak statement by a criminologist who was appointed by the federal government to oversee a critical change to the practice of solitary confinement in Canadian federal prisons. Eventually, the criminologist and his committee disbanded after a full year of waiting for the data they needed to do their job. The Correctional Services of Canada never gave it to them. In an interview with Maclean's, the criminologist put a sharp point on the issue we are discussing. So here's what it takes for the agency running Canada's prisons, the minister the agency reports to, and the entire rest of the Canadian federal apparatus to have no clue what is going on in institutions under exclusive federal jurisdiction. Here is how much ignoring you need to do, says the criminologist, to ignore the fate of prisoners in the darkest corners of our prisons. You need to be unimpressed by a court order, by the charter, by a new law duly debated in Parliament, by a team of conscientious investigators who had a year to wait for data they never received, by a spate of embarrassing news stories about the first set of failures, and by a final partial report which indicates the system is not close to working as designed, end quote. Alas, stories like this are not unusual. The correctional investigator's most recent report includes 3 in-depth studies. One about the need to address incidents of sexual abuse in our prisons. A second focuses on therapeutic units for dealing with mental and physical distress in our prisons. The third in-depth report focuses on the grave need for education inside our federal institutions. It's this third report that I want to talk to you about now. According to Chief Correctional Investigator Ivan Zinck, quote, federal corrections in Canada is falling further behind the rest of the industrialized world and is failing to provide offenders with the skills, education, and learning opportunities they need to return to the community and live productive, law-abiding lives, end quote. Imagine trying to navigate your world without a high school diploma. Somewhere in the order of 70% of Canadian federal prisoners lack that basic credential. While adult basic education is offered inside, the waiting lists for classes are long, and the learning support, technological and otherwise, where it exists, is scant. The teachers do their level best. They're talented and many of them are deeply committed. But the classrooms are under-resourced. Incarcerated learners, quote, have limited access to outdated standalone computers, says Mr. Zinck, that still use floppy disks. CSE runs local area 40 networks, he says, which are equipped with software from the early 2000s, have no access to the internet, contain limited reference materials, and have almost no technical capacity to support or facilitate e-learning of any kind, end quote. Prison libraries, where they exist, are also poorly resourced. In most instances, learners are left to work on their own, since classrooms, where they exist, are filled with learners working on a range of courses and grade levels. There are few lectures per se. Many students present with special learning challenges, but resources for anything above the minimum are scant. So imagine you have no high school diploma. And then imagine serving a lengthy sentence with zero access to the internet and any form of communications tech beyond limited use of a costly public telephone. 2 years or more in that environment, and reintegration into the world beyond bars becomes a step down a rabbit hole into an experience stranger than Alice's in Wonderland. While CSC is mandated to assist learners to complete high school, those who have aptitude and interest to study further have nowhere else to go. Think about the learning that happens here at Ambrose and how that learning has helped to grow the community it serves. It's not merely about taking on content. It's about growing into a more mature and life-giving view. It's about understanding who we are, what we care about, and how we might contribute to the world. If we are really concerned about correcting issues in prison, doesn't it make sense that we would want this kind of transformational experience for all we are trying to serve? One of my colleagues tells the story about one of his prison students, a man in his 30s who has spent more than a decade on the inside. My colleague was teaching philosophy with the Ephesus Project and had left a student a reading from Frederick Copleston's venerable History of Philosophy. When the instructor returned the next week, The student was animated. "Why didn't I know that people talk about these issues?" the young man said. He had grown up in a household full of the usual catastrophes, poverty, mental illness, broken marriages. He was a capable learner, but the family disruptions ensured school had been a low priority. But here he was, a man of abundant intelligence, who was finally listening to a long line of thinkers who had probed the issues he had probed, but had come to very different conclusions. Philosophy, he argued, had finally introduced him to a community he could belong to rather than rebel against. As the student became engaged with his post-secondary studies, he changed the environment around him. Books became fashionable on his unit. He helped the younger men who were struggling with their high school studies. These are small things, perhaps, but I think they're significant. It used to be that university courses were available to Canadian prisoners interested and able to complete them, but no more. The statutes technically provide that an inmate whose correctional plan calls for post-secondary education would be eligible for financial support from CSC, but in practice, it simply does not happen. Less than 3% of the total budget for the Correctional Services of Canada is directed toward education of any sort. And the service tries to patch the largest holes. They do what they can. But there's nothing left to redirect the most intelligent and creative members of the community they serve. And before we get frustrated with that fact and want to blame correctional services, remember who CSC is working for. They work for the Government of Canada, and the Government of Canada works for us. We, the voters, set the priorities for whichever party is in power. The situation in our prisons continues because we, the voting public, the Church of Christ, allow it. One might think that the transformative power we associate with learning would be an especially important element of a plan earnestly directed toward correction and reintegration. As one seasoned parole officer Riley observed to me early in my work with the Edmonton Institution, quote, "If we could harness and redirect all of the creativity, intelligence, and determination locked within these walls, we could change the world," end quote. Change the world. That's exactly what long-established research has discovered that prison education can do. But while we are struggling to justify expenditure on the minimum, any thought of supporting higher education is a pipe dream. And that's too bad. If the statistics associated with the success of post-secondary education became widely known, it would be clear that the refusal to offer post-secondary studies in prison is not only counterintuitive, but also brutally expensive to the taxpayer. While few would hope to emulate US policies that have led to the highest percentage of incarcerated citizens in the world, the sheer desperation of the prison situation in the United States has encouraged many private citizens and universities to develop creative programs to mediate the damaging experience of incarceration. There is now a collection of empirical research data that can tell us about the difference education in prison can make, and post-secondary education in particular. For example, a comprehensive research project by the RAND Corporation demonstrates that incarcerated individuals who took in education studies while in prison were 43% less likely to reoffend than those who did not. They conclude that our cost analyses showed that correctional education is highly cost-effective for incarcerated adults. For every dollar spent on correctional education, $5 are saved on 3-year re-incarceration costs, end quote. One of the most celebrated and successful post-secondary prison programs in the US is run by a small liberal arts college in upstate New York. It prides itself on the quality of its courses and the achievements of its students. In 1999, an undergraduate student named Max Kenner founded a student volunteer program that allowed undergraduates to share their learning with a community of learners at a local prison. Years later, the BARD Prison Initiative, or BPI, is a national leader in post-secondary prison education. In 2020, BARD conferred over 550 degrees to formerly incarcerated learners from 6 New York State prisons. Ellen Conliffe-Logman is the author of a new book about BPI. She is the Levy Institute Research Professor at Bard College and Distinguished Fellow in the Bard Prison Initiative. Before she came to Bard, she was the Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Logman notes that while all BPI students are typical of the general population at the prisons where they study, their results set them apart. Graduates of the Bard Prison Initiative have, she says, quote, all been convicted of felonies and are nearing the end of relatively long sentences. Few had finished high school before being sent to prison, yet all of them had met the full curricular requirements of a regular Bard College bachelor's degree program. While the national rate of return to prison in the United States is over 50%, the recidivism rate for graduates of the Bard Prison Initiative is 2%. And for those who have taken some classes but not completed a degree, the rate is 5%. 2% is a compelling number. Once again, the financial savings to the correctional system alone make a strong case for these programs. Here at home in Canada, recidivism rates, or the probability that someone who has served time will reoffend and return to prison, are disputed. But no matter whether you are more convinced by the private research that quotes a 2-year rate of 40.6% recidivism for the Canadian federal inmates, or by Correctional Services of Canada data that quotes a much lower rate of 23.4%, it's hard to argue against the positive cost savings that could be produced by better education programming in general and post-secondary education in particular. According to the Correctional Investigators 2018 report, it costs Canadian taxpayers approximately $120,571 per year to house a federal inmate. According to the same report, quote, with a staff to inmate ratio of 1:1, CSC is among the highest resourced correctional systems in the world, end quote. In other words, the question is not whether we spend the money, but how we spend it. If the rate of return to prison is reduced by superior correctional education programs, it does not take long before the savings add up. There are approximately 14,000 people currently held in Canadian federal prisons and some 9,000 supervised within the community. If 22 additional people come out of prison each year and stay out because they've studied at the post-secondary level while inside, the $2.7 million tab associated with a top-tier post-secondary degree like Bard's is paid in full with the tax savings. But while money is a powerful argument for post-secondary study in prison, I would argue that we, the Church, have even more compelling motivation. And our Canadian history records a moment when that greater argument was not only heard, but folded into top-level Government of Canada discussion about education in prison. Listen for a moment to Lucien Morin, now Emeritus Professor of Education, Laval University. In 1981, Monsieur Morin was a member of the Canadian Commission on Education in federal prisons. He published his report through the Solicitor General's office. Quote, "It is his initial relationship with his fellow man which makes man. Through this relationship, he becomes, and thus becomes himself. Consequently, education in prison obliges us to determine, once again, the original meaning of educational activity, to rediscover the other, and to relearn to distinguish the essential from the urgent. The urgent is the solution of facility, that which gives immediate results, that which correctional education has too often endorsed and followed in the past. The essential, in contrast, lies beyond what is profitable, beyond the universe of provision and nervous security. The essential is based on giving, for we create what we do. One who punishes creates punishment. One who corrects creates correction. One who gives creates education, which in its original etymological senses properly means to nourish. Education in prison has no other justification than that of sharing." For all of his idealism, Monsieur Morin and his co-authors were no starry-eyed ivory tower types. They fully understood the usual public objections to any plan designed to educate those who have erred. Objection number one, the prisoner is an enemy to society. Objection number two, the instinctive laws of vengeance should be allowed to prevail. Number three, the prisoner should be regarded as a, quote, polished and cunning hypocrite for whom it is inadvisable to provide him through education with the means to refine his vices. And finally, objection number four, any meaningful education program would be too large a management issue. To all of these objections, Morin and his committee responded with a simple answer. They reaffirmed their, quote, profound belief that an inmate is above all a human being, a person, end quote, and advocated that what could be done should be done. They went on to argue that there is a more fundamental and dignified way of approaching this question. It consists in looking not only at the prisoner's right, but more profoundly at the moral obligation upon which this right rests. That is, the human obligation to fraternity, to brotherly love, to charitable action towards fellow human beings. It is, Morin argued, a concept nourished by the ideas of generosity and brotherhood whose overflowing richness suffices to surpass and supersede the notion of right. Most importantly, Morin argued that, quote, what is fundamental to this idea of fraternal obligation is that it implies the desire and the will to do good to those we feel do not deserve it. If you love only those who love you, what is your real reward? If you greet only those who greet you, what extraordinary feat have you accomplished? Do you hear the scriptural resonances? In short, if necessity were sufficient for the establishment of right, people would economize on obligation, but the saving would be mortal. For at the same time, humanity would be skimping on its conscience, end quote. It's a bracing document, one that dares to move beyond the plethora of excuses rendered for incivility. This, my friends, is a report to the government of Canada. It's a vision cast in a day long since gone, to imagine that we might meet ill with good, that we might reconcile where we can reconcile, renew where we can renew, is a startling reorientation to the conversation about what we owe the prisoner. As I said at the outset, I know a little about what it feels like to be part of the miracle of nourishing a capable but imprisoned mind. The work with the Ephesus Project has brought me into close contact with a small group of incarcerated learners whom I've come to know for the last number of years. In the summer of 2013, I began volunteering to teach at the Edmonton Institution, our local maximum security prison. There's a team of approximately 12 professors, many of them from King's, who work one-to-one with individuals who are interested in and able to do post-secondary studies. Unlike minimum and medium security prisons, the Max offers comparatively few programs. The men who live there spend much of their time in their cells. There are few distractions, few healthy opportunities to use the time to correct whatever issues brought these men to this place. Let me share with you now a day in the life of a prison professor. It's a long walk across asphalt to the first gate at the Edmonton Institution. The sun glistens on the spikes of the barbed wire fence as to my left, shots echo to the firing range from the firing range next door. These shots, I know, are directed toward targets, stand-ins for human beings. The prison officers are practicing. Before me and to the right, guard towers survey the low, flat buildings. These brick structures pinned against the glorious blue Alberta sky, and the farm fields that surround them look like they are set in a Garden of Eden. The contrast is jarring. As I move through the first set of doors, I arrive at an airport-like security check. An officer behind bulletproof glass slides a metal tray through a slot. I put my ID on it and push it back. Moments later, there's a loud click, and I can open the heavy door beside me. I arrive at a desk where paperwork and signatures are required. Next, I move through a metal detector and two more heavy sets of doors, each one releasing with another sharp click and closing behind me with a heavy metal thud. Outside again and into a second building. More clicks, more thuds, and I report to Control 1. Through the bulletproof glass, the officer on duty hands me a personal alarm and I strap it to a lanyard with my security clearance in full view. Then off again down a hallway punctuated by metal gates and doors, more clicks, more thuds. Finally, I hear the hydraulic motor as the last door slides open and my student bounds up the stairs, books in hand. Down the corridor we walk together. One more huge metal door, click, thud. Surrounded by cinder blocks walls, we sit on a cold metal bench before a cold metal table and begin the work. English 214, the prison edition. Since 2013, I have interviewed all of the incarcerated students that the Ephesus Project teaches. As I've met each one, I've been struck by the contrast between the stark prison environment and the ordinary humanity of the students. I've been amazed by the gift of grace that has allowed me to catch a glimpse of the potential, the good, in every one of these learners. I've been accustomed, of course, to seeing the beauty in my students. All of the lovely souls who have entered my classroom over the last 20 plus years have been a gift to me. There is something particular about the teaching relationship, about the way it requires me to show up and be the best instructor I know how to be. And yet for all that, how the learning that happens in those spaces is so clearly not of my doing. The mercy and the grace that flows between student instructor is a kind of invisible magic. Something more than either of us is present, especially when the learning soaks down deeper than the overt topic of conversation, the play, the poem, the novel, when the learning touches the something more that makes us human. My work with the prison has been a kind of Damascus Road experience for me. I, like the Apostle Paul, needed to have the scales removed from my eyes before I could really see. This clearing of my field of vision cut through my own fear and prejudice and self-absorption to allow me to really see the students before me. While the environment in which we conduct our studies is, frankly, inhumane, the students themselves are remarkably ordinary. In interview after interview, I meet people of complexity and beauty, of limitation and potential. I meet the wounded and the wise, often in the same person. Early on, I was startled into the realization that each of these incarcerated students, for all they had done, all the pain they had caused, and let's not be sliding around the point here, I'm talking about theft, violence, murder. For all that, there was in each and every one of these different people a mark of beauty and grace. Image bearers they are, I realize. I find that in every case, in every learner I interview, God has revealed to me some small glimpse of his love for his people. What a privilege. What an honor. So, what might your mission story sound like? As members of a learning community, I know you have so much to share, and I know many of you are already out there sharing. The mission field in our own backyard is diverse and full of opportunity. As members of the Calgary community, your closest CSC prison for men is Bowden Institution, which is off exit 365 on the QE2 highway near Innisfail. The nearest prison for women is the Edmonton Institution for Women, or EIFW. Bowden is a medium and minimum security prison, so there's generally a broader range of programs available there than in the maximum security environment, while EIFW houses all three security classes. I know that University of Alberta offers a post-secondary program at EIFW. Each prison welcomes volunteers for a variety of programs. So ask yourself, what do I and my friends do here on the outside that we could bring to the inside? Dancing, art, book clubs? Be creative. Until the men and women serving time are released, it's our job to bring community to them. As I describe my work in the prison, you may also be acutely aware that volunteering in the prison is not for you. And that's okay too. Might you be able to serve as a reintegration support? The John Howard Society offers programs to help the formerly incarcerated transition into community life in the Calgary area. They're looking for volunteers. Can you help? Not interested in working with prisoners or former prisoners? No problem. The kingdom of heaven is a glorious both and kind of world. Are you deeply concerned about the victims of crime? Great. There's work for you too. Victims need love, support, deep communal care. They need to be supported and cared for so thoroughly that they're held back from revenge. We, the church, know that vengeance belongs to God alone. When humans take it into their own hands, things end poorly for everyone. Victims need to be heard, consulted, and supported. The Calgary Police Service runs VAST, Victim Assistance Support Team, and it's near you. They're looking for volunteers. Is your schedule full? No time to offer? I understand that too. But please look for the small opportunities. Our God is a God of details. That patient conversation you have with an advocate of tough on crime may do more than you can possibly imagine to change a person's heart, to change a person's perspective. The comment you make about our prisons to your local member of parliament, your understanding of what we owe to Canadian society by caring for all participants in our societal brokenness, may make a positive difference, even if it's just slipped into a meeting on another topic. God honors our efforts, and the time you've taken to listen right here, right now, may be a seed for the future. Be open to the idea and let the God of miracles, small and large, plant those seeds as he will. Thank you for the privilege of your listening ear. I can't wait to see what will happen as the Ambrose community enters this mission field.